أنا دكتور خالد وليد، ربان سفينة النجاة إلى شواطئ بكة القدس. I am Dr. Khaled Waleed, the captain of the ship of salvation to the shores of Baka, Jerusalem.
All right, so get this. You're ready to dive deep into some seriously mind-bending research.
I think so. Let's hear it.
Okay, well, we're going to be talking about this Dr. Khaled Waleed's interpretation of the Quran.
Okay.
Specifically, this phrase that's usually translated as Master of the Day of Judgment.
Malik Yam al-Din. Yeah, a phrase that's often misunderstood, I think.
Now, what I think is really fascinating here is that Dr. Waleed is saying that this phrase reveals like a whole different way of thinking about time and judgment.
Absolutely. And his interpretation really hinges on two key points.
Okay.
The meaning of yam and the specific word used for master.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit.
Yeah.
So yam, usually translated as day, Dr. Waleed says, actually refers to the whole concept of time, right? Not just like a 24-hour period.
Exactly. He believes that yam, in this context, encompasses the entire system of time itself, past, present, and future.
So it's not about a single day of reckoning.
Right.
About God's dominion over the very fabric of time.
Exactly.
That's a huge shift in perspective.
Huge. Yeah.
And then there's the word master itself.
Right. And this is where it gets even more interesting. Dr. Waleed emphasizes that the Quran uses the word Malik, meaning owner or master, not Malik, which would translate as king.
That seems like such a subtle distinction. Why is that so significant to him?
Because it speaks to the nature of God's control, you know? A king rules over his subjects, makes laws, metes out punishments.
Right.
But an owner has inherent absolute control. If God is the owner of time, it implies a far deeper level of involvement than simply ruling over it.
Wow. Yeah. I'm starting to see why this is causing such a stir.
Yeah.
It completely redefines how we think about God's role in the universe.
Yeah.
And even our own place within it. But here's where it gets really wild.
Okay.
Dr. Waleed links this understanding of time to a completely different understanding of Quranic geography.
Okay.
He claims that Mecca, as we know it today, wasn't the original Mecca.
Yes, that's another key element of Dr. Waleed's interpretation. He argues that the true location of the Holy Mosque is Baka, Jerusalem, in Palestine.
He even cites specific Quranic verses and geological formations to support his claim. I was particularly struck by his description of the Dead Sea's tongue.
Oh, wow.
And how it relates to the Quran's language. What's the significance of that detail?
Well, for Dr. Waleed, everything is interconnected.
Okay.
He sees the Quran as a meticulously crafted document with every word, every geographical reference carrying profound meaning. The Dead Sea's unique features, including this peninsula that juts out like a tongue, are not just random occurrences. They're signs, clues that point towards a deeper understanding of the Quran's message.
Okay, so we've got God as the owner of time.
Right.
A reimagined Quranic geography centered on Baka, Jerusalem.
Right.
And these intriguing geological clues. But how does this all tie into Dr. Waleed's view of judgment?
Yeah.
And what about the traditional idea of the Day of Judgment as this cataclysmic event?
That's a great question, and it leads us to another core element of Dr. Waleed's work.
Okay.
The distinction between two lineages, the Adamites and those who follow the figure of Israel.
This is where his interpretation gets particularly complex and, to be honest, a bit controversial. He draws a sharp contrast between these two lineages using the metaphor of a good tree and a cursed tree.
Right, and he associates the Adamites, whom he links to the Arabs, with the good tree. He sees them as representing a lineage that's more in tune with God's will and the true meaning of faith.
And the cursed tree, that's where things get a little sensitive. He associates those who follow Israel, and he's very clear that this is not Prophet Jacob with this cursed tree, suggesting they represent a deviation from the true path.
And this duality, according to Dr. Waleed, plays out in terms of belief, action, and even the way each lineage approaches Hajj. He argues that those who follow Israel focus on lineage and external rituals, while the Adamites prioritize a more sincere internal connection with God.
So where does this leave the listener who's trying to make sense of it all? What are the implications of Dr. Waleed's perspective on these two lineages
That's a great question.
for understanding judgment, both in this life and in the hereafter?
And one we'll explore further in the next part of this deep dive.
Okay.
What's crucial to remember is that Dr. Waleed's work is deeply rooted in his understanding of God as the owner of time. He views history, prophecy, and even the actions of individuals within this framework of a divinely ordained system.
It's a powerful and, frankly, pretty challenging perspective. But we're not shying away from the tough questions here. We're going to keep unpacking Dr. Waleed's ideas, exploring their implications, and hopefully leaving you with some serious food for thought. Stay tuned. There's a lot more to uncover.
Yeah, so we've been discussing Dr. Waleed's view of God as the owner of time, a concept that completely redefines our understanding of divine involvement. It's not just about a distant ruler watching events unfold. It's about a God who's intimately woven into the very fabric of time itself.
And he ties this directly to the idea of a singular, divinely preserved Quran. He's pretty critical of any variations in readings or interpretations, isn't he?
Yes, for Dr. Waleed, there's only one true Quran, and understanding it requires recognizing the specific geographical and historical context in which it was revealed. This means going beyond the literal words on the page and delving into the deeper layers of meaning embedded within the text.
It's almost like he's saying the Quran itself is a map, not just a spiritual one, but a literal geographical map that leads us to a deeper understanding of God's plan.
That's a great way to put it. And he emphasizes that this map points us to a very specific location, Baka, Jerusalem, which he believes is the true site of the Holy Mosque.
And this is where his interpretation of the two lineages, the Adamites and those who follow the figure of Israel, really comes into play, right? He sees this location as central to understanding the struggles between these two groups throughout history.
Exactly. Dr. Waleed paints a vivid picture of this ongoing struggle, suggesting that control over the holy sanctuary has shifted back and forth between these two lineages. He sees the Adamites, who he associates with the Arabs, as representing those who uphold the true faith, while those who follow Israel represent a deviation from that path.
And he's pretty blunt in his assessment of those who follow Israel, using some pretty strong language to describe their actions and beliefs. He seems particularly concerned about their influence in the modern world, linking them to trends like globalism, which he sees as a force working against God's plan.
Yes, and this is where it's crucial to remember that we're dealing with a single interpretation, one that's undeniably controversial. It's important to approach these ideas critically, considering the historical context and recognizing that there's a spectrum of interpretations within Islam.
Absolutely. We're not here to tell anyone what to believe, but rather to explore these complex ideas and hopefully spark some deeper thinking.
Yeah.
So getting back to Dr. Waleed's framework, if God is the owner of time and there's this divinely ordained system in place, what does that mean for our understanding of free will? Do we have any agency in this grand cosmic drama, or is everything predetermined?
That's one of the most fascinating and challenging aspects of Dr. Waleed's work. He doesn't shy away from the idea of predestination, but he also emphasizes the importance of individual choice and action.
So it's not a simple case of everything being set in stone.
No, it's much more nuanced than that. He talks about how God has laid out a path, a clear set of guidelines for humanity to follow. But within that framework, we have the freedom to choose our own course. Our choices have consequences, both in this life and in the hereafter, and those consequences are ultimately determined by God's justice.
It's like we're navigating a maze where the paths are laid out, but we have to choose which turns to take. And the choices we make determine whether we reach the center of the maze or get lost along the way.
That's a great analogy, and it highlights the importance of understanding the map, of knowing which paths lead towards God's favor and which lead towards deviation for Dr. Waleed. That map is the Quran, understood within its proper geographical and historical context.
And that brings us back to this idea of cyclical history, right? Dr. Waleed talks about how these struggles between those who uphold the true faith and those who deviate from it have played out throughout history. He even connects the destruction of past civilizations to their failure to heed God's warnings and follow the right path. It's a pretty sobering message, suggesting that if we don't learn from the past, we're doomed to repeat it.
It's definitely a call to action, urging us to recognize the patterns of history and make choices that align with God's will. He even points to specific events happening in the world today, suggesting they fit within this larger cycle of divine judgment.
He mentions the Dead Sea, again referring to it as the Quranic Sea, and specifically highlighting a feature he calls the tongue. What's the connection there?
That's a detail that might seem small at first, But it actually ties into everything we've been discussing.
Yeah.
For Dr. Waleed, even the geological features of the Dead Sea, like this peninsula that juts out like a tongue, are imbued with meaning.
So it's not just a random geographical quirk?
Not at all. He connects the Dead Sea's unique shape, specifically the tongue, to the structure of the Quranic language itself, arguing that it reflects the divine precision and interconnectedness of everything in creation.
Okay, that's officially blowing my mind again.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from God's ownership of time to the significance of Baha Jerusalem, these two contrasting lineages, the cyclical nature of history, now even the geological features of the Dead Sea as reflections of divine order. But there's still one more crucial piece of the puzzle we need to address. How does all of this tie into Dr. Waleed's view of the Day of Judgment and what happens to those who choose the wrong path, who stray from the divinely ordained system? Okay, so we've been on quite a journey exploring Dr. Waleed's interpretation of the Quran, and now we're at like the ultimate question. What happens at the end? How does his view of the Day of Judgment differ from that kind of traditional understanding of like a cataclysmic event?
Well, this is where Dr. Waleed's reinterpretation of Yom as time becomes truly crucial. Remember, he's not talking about a single 24-hour day, but about the culmination of God's mastery over the entire system of time.
So instead of a sudden earth-shattering event, it's more of a process.
Precisely, he sees judgment as an ongoing reality woven into the very fabric of time itself. It's not just about what happens on a single day, but about the consequences of our choices and actions rippling through time.
Okay, that's a pretty radical departure from the fire and brimstone imagery we often associate with the Day of Judgment.
Yeah.
But what about the Quranic descriptions of paradise and hell? How do those fit into Dr. Waleed's framework?
He doesn't shy away from those descriptions. In fact, he uses them to emphasize the gravity of our choices. Remember, for Dr. Waleed, everything is part of this divinely ordained system. Every act, every decision we make has consequences that extend beyond our immediate understanding.
He keeps mentioning the Quranic sea and this feature called the tongue. Does that tie into his view of judgment as well?
Absolutely. He places several key Quranic events in the region of the Dead Sea, specifically near the Al-Lisan Peninsula, which translates to the tongue. He sees this geographical feature as a physical embodiment of the Quran's precision, even mirroring its linguistic structure.
So the Dead Sea isn't just a random body of water. It's a stage where divine judgment has played out throughout history.
Exactly. He connects it to stories like the drowning of Pharaoh and the overwhelming event described in Surah Al-Ghashiyah, suggesting these events foreshadow the ultimate judgment that awaits those who deviate from God's path.
It's a pretty intense concept, to say the least. But what about those who do follow the right path, who align themselves with God's will? What does their judgment look like in Dr. Waleed's framework?
For them, judgment is an affirmation of their choices, a confirmation that they've lived in accordance with the divinely ordained system. It's a recognition of their efforts to embody the true meaning of faith and walk the path laid out by God.
So it's not just about avoiding punishment. It's about striving for a deeper connection with God and aligning oneself with this cosmic order.
Precisely. And this understanding of judgment as an ongoing process woven into the very fabric of time has profound implications for how we live our lives. It challenges us to consider the long-term consequences of our choices, not just in this world, but in the hereafter.
It's a heavy responsibility, but also in a way empowering.
Yeah.
It suggests that we have a role to play in shaping our own destiny, even within the framework of God's plan.
Exactly. And it underscores the importance of seeking knowledge, of delving into the Quran and understanding its message within its proper context. It's a lifelong journey of learning, reflection, and striving to embody the true meaning of faith.
Wow, this has been an incredibly deep dive. We've gone from reinterpreting a single phrase to exploring a whole new way of understanding time judgment, geography, and even the Quran itself.
And it all highlights the diversity of thought within Islamic scholarship and the importance of engaging with different perspectives, even those that might challenge our assumptions.
Absolutely. We've just scratched the surface of Dr. Waleed's work, but hopefully this deep dive has given you a glimpse into his unique and thought-provoking interpretation of the Quran. As always, we encourage you to continue exploring these ideas, seek out diverse perspectives, and keep those sources coming.
أنا دكتور خالد وليد ربان سفينة النجاة إلى شواطئ بكة القدس. I am Dr. Khaled Waleed, the captain of the ship of salvation to the shores of Baha Jerusalem.